Hello friends, today I am going to talk about the Indian educational system in the ancient India. The topics that I am going to cover today in this topic will be the philosophy of life in ancient India, the fundamentals of ancient Indian education system, the Rig Vedic education, education during the later Vedic age, education in the epics and the sutras, Brahmanic education, evolution of education in the Buddhist era. Also, we are going to make a comparative study of the Buddhist and the Brahmanic education system. And in the end, I would love to discuss and describe some ancient Indian universities and centers of education in the ancient India. India has a rich tradition of learning and education right from the antiquity. These were handed over generations to generations, either through oral or written medium. A single feature of ancient Indian or Hindu civilization is that it has been molded and shaped in the course of its history more by religious than by political or economic influences. The fundamental principles of social, political and economic life were welded into a comprehensive theory which is called religion in Hindu thought. The total configuration of ideals, practices and conduct is called dharma in this ancient tradition. Indian culture is suffused thoroughly by religious values. The approach of our forefathers to life, their subtle analysis and codification of duties all indicate their cherished spiritual values. Their political as well as social realities were not circumscribed within the narrow geographical bounds. Their attitude to life was characterized by width of vision, and they identified their duty with devotion to the ideal of summum bonum of mankind. Multidimensional progress of all mankind became the sole objective of a civilization. The ancient Indian polity, eschewing the imponderables of violence, friction, and self-aggrandizement, was based on the principles of love, honorable conduct, and good behavior. Life had a definite aim, an ideal, and the attainment of which was thought to transcend all material achievements. The educational evolution in ancient India was also founded upon this very ideal. Dr. Radhakamal Mukherjee said, "Learning in India through the ages had been prized and pursued not for its own sake, if we may so put it, but for the sake and as a part of religion. It was sought as the means of self-realization, as the means to the highest end of life, viz. Mukti or emancipation." Ancient Indian education is also to be understood as being ultimately the outcome of the Indian theory of knowledge as part of the corresponding scheme of life and values. The scheme takes full account of the fact that life includes death, and the two forms the whole truth. This gives a particular angle of vision, a sense of perspective and proportion in which the material and the moral, the physical and spiritual, the perishable and permanent interests and values of life are clearly defined and strictly differentiated. Of all the people of the world, the Hindu is the most impressed and affected by the fact of death as the central fact of life. The individual's supreme duty is thus to achieve his expansion into the absolute, his self-fulfillment, for he is a potential God, a spark of divine. Education must aid in this self-fulfillment and not in the acquisition of mere objective knowledge. What has been the philosophy of life in ancient India? The outstanding characteristics of the ancient philosophy of life in India are that while no great significance is attached to the physical existence in the world, yet the importance of action in this material world is not overlooked. The doctrine of action, karma, occupies a very significant place in the Indian system of life and of education. Action or karma should not be for the redemption of mankind. This has been the ideal of the doctrine of karma as also of the educational system of ancient India. Hence, the ultimate object of devotion for an individual is the Brahma and not this world. The material world is the lab of the human soul, where the individual has to receive systematic education for bringing about self-development. The ancient Aryan culture of India lays the greatest emphasis on plain living and high thinking as the moral basis of education for self-development. Consequently, the individual has been bidden necessarily to gain both kinds of knowledge, materialistic and spiritual. All fields of Vidya or knowledge were thus divided into two broad streams, the Paravidya, the higher knowledge, that is the spiritual wisdom, and the Aparavidya, the lower knowledge, that is the secular sciences. The latter is needed to live a comfortable life there. The former helps one to be fully prepared for the hereafter. Hence, a balanced combination of both is advocated so that both civilization and culture are imparted. The materialistic education embodies various aspects of the knowledge of physical sciences. It is for a student that the developed social structure exists. The student engaged in the pursuit of material knowledge has consequently been treated as the fulcrum or the axis of the social structure, for in his development lies the well-being of the society. Spiritual knowledge has been regarded as the means of attaining the final beatitude. For the realization of the great truth, deep meditation in privacy is essential, and hence the individual has been bidden to take recourse to severe penance, tap, once again. The devotee of spiritual knowledge has been enjoined upon to keep aloof from material objects and to consume himself wholly in self-meditation, because the main elements constituting divine or spiritual knowledge cannot be understood and realized through hearing or by means of intellect. These can be realized only through divine graciousness. The ancient Indian system of education is pervaded with the desire for bringing about salvation and final beatitude along with the full physical development of the individual, in the same manner as the philosophy of life is shot through by the spirit of religion. The Indian system of education caters to both physical and spiritual solitariness. Fundamentals of ancient Indian education. Ancient Indian education had been evolved strictly on the foundations of Indian epistemological and philosophical traditions. The idea of the ephemerality of life and the world, the concept of ultimate death, and the futility of mundane pleasures had provided them with a special angle of vision. The entire educational tradition originated in these principles. Thus, the Indian sages devoted themselves to the study of supra-sensible world and spiritual powers and molded their life accordingly. The ultimate aim of education emerged as the Chit Vrit Nirodh, the control of mental activities connected with the so-called concrete world. However, education did not neglect the development of the pupil's powers for his all-sided advancement. Some of the fundamentals of the ancient Indian education system had been that the knowledge had been related to life. During the ancient times in India, the pupil, away from the haunts of din and distractions of the material world, amidst beautiful natural surroundings, sitting at the feet of his teacher, would comprehend all the intricate problems of life through listening and meditation. He would not remain contented with mere bookish learning, but acquire fairly practical knowledge of the world and society through close contact with the people. An attempt was made to make the student capable of experiencing the supreme truth himself and mold the society accordingly. There was a close association between teacher and student which resulted in all-round development. The residence of the pupil at the house of the teacher, accompanied by a sense of devoted service, had been a unique tradition in ancient India. The pupil, through such a close contact with his teacher, would naturally imbibe his qualities through emulation. This was regarded as indispensable for the fullest development of his personality, because the teacher was supposed to symbolize all the good ideals, traditions, and code of behavior of the society from where the pupil hailed. Development in social work. Another important characteristic of ancient Indian educational system was that the same was wedded to the practical ends of life. The pupil's residence at his teacher's house would make it possible for him to develop social contacts, as it was his sacred duty to collect fuel wood, supply water, and do other household odd jobs for the teacher. In this way, not only would he receive instructions related to domestic life, but also learn the concrete lesson of the dignity of labor and social service. Vocational training. Students were given training in occupations of animal husbandry, agriculture and dairy farming, etc., by tending his teacher's cows and serving him in diverse ways. Evidently, the ancient Indian education was not merely theoretical, but was related to the realities of life. The modern concept of learning by doing, as understood in the West today, was the very core and essence of education in ancient India. Life served as the laboratory for the educational experimentation from where many noble traditions were developed. Similarly, begging alms by the pupils for their own subsistence and service of the Guru fostered in them humanitarian virtues. Thus, ancient Indian educational system was developed in terms of the needs of the individual and that of the society, and therefore its efflorescence was natural. It had a definite ideal and a definite mission. The ancient educational centers situated amidst fauna and flora and beauties of nature were the perennial and inexhaustible fountainheads of Indian civilization and culture. The ancient Indian teachers evolved a special form of education whereby harmony was established between materialism and spiritualism, and human life thus headed towards greater perfection. We are now going to study about the four Vedas. The Vedas, regarded as the oldest among the literatures of the world, are the original sources of the philosophy of life in ancient India. A study of these Vedas will enable one to get a thorough knowledge not only of the philosophy of life, but also of the whole fabric of ancient Indian culture. Consequently, the entire literature and philosophy of India, the Upanishads, the Smritis, and the Puranas, all acknowledge the superiority of Vedas. The Vedas occupy a very important place in the Indian life. The basis of Indian culture lies in the Vedas, which are four in number: Rigved, Samved, Yajurved, and Atharvaved. Vedas have their own characteristic features. Through them, we are able to know about the culture, civilization, life, and philosophy of people in ancient India. Vedas symbolize the chief objective of human life, which has been deliverance from this world of births and deaths. The Indian philosophy of life has never accepted life as purposeless. Before giving a detailed account of the Vedic education, it is necessary to make a short appraisal of the four Vedas, as the education of that period was basically based on them. The Rigved. The Rigved is established as the earliest work not merely of the Hindus, but of all Indo-European languages and humanity. It lays the foundation upon which Hindu civilization has been building up through the ages. Broadly speaking, it is on a foundation of plain living and high thinking. Some of the prayers of the Rig Veda, like the widely known Gayatri Mantram, also found in Samved and Yajurved, touch the highest point of knowledge and sustain human souls to this day. The Rig Veda itself exhibits an evolution, and the history of the Rig Veda is a history of culture of the age. Other Vedas. Following Rig Veda came into existence the three Samhitas of Sam, Yaju and Atharva in close succession. These Vedas ushered in a new kind of literature. The order of hymns included in the Rig Veda is not in accord with that of the sacrifices, so much so there are some such hymns as have no relation to the yagna or sacrifice at all. On the contrary, in the Sam, Yaju and Atharva, the hymns follow closely in order of the sacrifices. Priesthood was gaining ground. Higher education later on related itself to priesthood and the ritualistic aspect of religion. The curriculum of education was the same for all the students called brahmacharinis. Each of them was required to attain proficiency in the melodies of verses and ritualistic aspects of yagna. In course of time, however, essentiality of division of labor was strongly felt owing to the growing complex nature of formal aspect of sacrifice, because no single individual priest could be expected to specialize in the triple aspect of the yagna. The Samved. The compilation of all the hymns recited on the occasion of Som Yagna came to be known as the Samved. The Yajurved. It is a collection of prose mantras. Though the duty of chanting the hymns on the occasion of sacrifice was mainly undertaken by the Hotri, the first order of priesthood, yet certain hymns related to prayer or invocation were sung by the Adharvaryus, who were closely associated with sacrificial operations. Consequently, a separate training school was established for the education of these priests. The elementary prose literature of India, which culminated in the Upanishads, lies in the rudimentary form in the Yajurved. We get in the Yajurved glimpses of the religious and secular aspects of life in India. The Atharvaved. In the beginning, only 3 Vedas were popular. In the course of time, the 4th Ved, called the Atharvaved, was also recognized. It is more original in contents. Unlike the preceding Vedas, the majority of mantras in this Veda have not been adapted from the Rig Veda. The Atharvaved is thoroughly secular in character, containing a vivid description of various arts and sciences. Now we will look into the evolution of education in the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda, in the form in which we have it now, is the compilation out of old material, a collection and selection of 1017 hymns out of the vast literature of hymns which have been accumulating for a long period. When the Rig Vedic text was thus fixed and appropriated for purposes of the Samhita, its editors had to think out the principles on which the hymns could be best arranged. These show considerable literary skill, originality of design, and insight into religious needs. Rishis were chosen who were seers of truth. Their works were utilized to constitute 6 different mandals. These rishis are Vishwamitra, Vamdev, Atril, Bhardwaj and Vashisht. When the highest knowledge was thus built up by these seers and revealed and stored up in the hymns, the methods were then necessarily evolved by which such knowledge could be acquired, conserved and transmitted to posterity. Thus, every rishi was a teacher who would start by imparting to his son the texts of the knowledge he had personally acquired, and such texts would be the special property of his family. Each such family of rishis was thus functioning like a Vedic school, admitting pupils for instruction in the literature or texts in its possession. The relations between teacher and taught was well established in the Rig Veda. The methods of education naturally varied with the capacity of pupils. Self-realization by means of tap would be for the few. It is believed that these sages, by virtue of their tap or asceticism and yoga, were gifted with the vision of a clairvoyant, capable of knowing about the past, present and the future. The system of education which evolved in the Rig Veda concerns itself with the acquisition of the supreme knowledge, religion and Brahma. The aim of the Veda was the knowledge of the ultimate truth and the realization of the supreme. The curriculum of Vedic education. The students started the recitation of the Vedic hymns in early hours of morning. The chanting of mantras had been evolved into the form of a fine art. Special attention was paid to the correct pronunciation of words, pad or even letters. The Vedic knowledge was imparted by the guru or the teacher to the pupil through regulated and prescribed pronunciation, which the pupil would commit to memory, having listened to it alternatively. Only that knowledge which was received from the lips of the teacher was regarded as purely Vedic. Thus, the teaching was oral. Various subjects were incorporated in the curriculum of Vedic education. Grammar, rhetoric, astrology, logic, nirukti was the main subjects. Vedanga was the synonym of all these subjects taken together. The performance of sacrifice, correct pronunciation, knowledge of prosody, etymology, grammar and jyotishi or the science of calendar. The study of logic occupied a special place because knowledge of any other subject was tested on its basis. Debates and discussions were organized for training in logic. Though the Rig Vedic education, being essentially religious and philosophical in character, was imparted only to those who were fit to make quest of eternal truth and acquire supreme knowledge, yet there was arrangement for secular education and vocational training for the masses. The people would receive training in diverse arts and crafts for material gain. Agriculture, horticulture and animal husbandry attained to a high norm of progress. Thus we can safely conclude that secular, social and practical form of education was in existence during the Rig Vedic era. Two methods of teaching were being practiced during the Vedic period. The first method was oral and the second was based on chintan, that is thinking. In the oral method, the students were to memorize the mantras, Vedic hymns, in order that they might not be changed wrongly and they might remain preserved in their original forms. Thinking method was another part of the teaching method. Through this, an attempt was made to reserve the Ved mantras and Richayas. The thinking principle, that is the Manan Shakti, was reckoned higher than the subject of thinking. So the primary subject of education was the mind itself. The pupil had mainly to educate himself and achieve his own mental growth. Education was reduced to the three simple processes of Shravan, Manan and Nidhyasan. Shravan was listening to the truths as they fell from the lips of the teacher. Knowledge was technically called Shruti, or what the ear heard, and not what was seen in writing. The second process of knowledge, called Manan, implies that the pupil has to think out for himself the meaning of the lessons imparted to him orally by his teacher so that they may assimilate fully. The third step, known as Nidhyasan, means complete comprehension by the pupil of the truth that is taught so that he may live the truth and not merely explain it by word. Some of the main characteristics of Vedic education can be summed up as follows. The admission was made by the formal ceremony, Upnayan or initiation, by which the pupil left the home of his natural parents for that of the preceptor. In this new home, he had a second birth and was called Dwij or twice born. The pupil was eligible to admission to the preceptor's house only on the basis of his moral fitness and unimpeachable conduct. The discipline of brahmacharya or celibacy was compulsory. It was one of the sacred duties of the pupil to serve his preceptor. He pledged devotion to him in thought, speech and deed and worshipped him as his own father or God. Brahm Sangh was an organization where meritorious students were given chances to fulfill their quest of higher knowledge. There was equality between the sexes in the field of knowledge. The Rig Veda mentions women rise called Brahmavadnis. Princes and other leading Kshatriyas were trained in all the manifold sciences to make them fit for government. Some cities became renowned because of their teachers, and the chief among them were Varanasi, Taxila from the day of Buddha, and Kanchi in the beginning of the Christian era. In the Rig Vedic period, occupations were not dependent on one system. At that time, the nature of education was religious, but this sort of education was meant only for those persons who, rising above the mundane interests, were capable of attaining spiritual heights. Ordinary people were still engaged to advance the material well-being of the society. This age is exemplary for its economic, political and religious progress, and famous for various arts and crafts, agriculture, commerce and trade. It thus leads to the inevitable inference that the period must have evolved an elaborate system of vocational, scientific and commercial education. Thus, the ideal of the Vedic education was lofty. Ample opportunities were provided to the pupil for the development of his personality. The preceptors took personal care of the pupils, which resulted inevitably in a multi-dimensional development. The educational system of Vedic period achieved a pronounced success in connection with character formation, development of personality and contribution to knowledge in all branches of learning as well as social well-being and material prosperity. Vedic education was essentially spiritual and religious in character, yet it did not ignore the material aspect, the evidence whereof is available in the Yajurveda and the Atharvaveda. Thus, it points unmistakably to the future evolution of Aryan culture. Now we move on to the education during the later Vedic age. As we have seen in the Vedic period, the educational sphere was inordinately dominated by priesthood, hence knowledge pertaining to sacrificial rituals had considerably advanced. There were scholars and thinkers who had developed an attitude characterized by mysticism towards life and meditated on speculative subjects such as God, soul and universe, life and death, etc. In later Vedic age, this trend of speculative thought grew intense and vehement. The philosophers now meditated upon self-realization. Their mystical experiences manifested themselves through the scriptures known as Brahmanas and Aryankas. The Upanishads were next to emerge into being. The Upanishads aver that whatever good is done with full knowledge and awareness becomes forceful and fruitful in life. They are the archives preserving ancient culture and civilization. The Vedanta, an important trend in philosophical thought, which can rightly be regarded as the culminating point of the Vedic knowledge, was revealed through the pages of the Upanishads. The spread and propagation of the post-Vedic education was influenced through diverse institutions known as Sakhas, Charnas, Parishads, Kulas and Gotras, and improvement on the oral tradition of the Vedic literature. The basic aim of education during the later Vedic period has been the same as during the Vedic age, that is the salvation of the soul, but the method of attaining this goal has been different between the two periods. During the Vedic period, the student used to attain the objective of education through penance while living with Acharya as member of his family. During the post-Vedic period, Yagna replaced the penance and a number of procedures were prescribed for the same. The Upanayan Sanskar ceremony was so important during the post-Vedic period that it was usually regarded as second birth of the individual. Ved mantras, that is the hymns and the verses, were principally taught in the Vedic period. During the post-Vedic period, various types of literatures were produced pertaining to different Vedas. The curriculum consisted of Veds, history, Puranas, grammar, mathematics, Brahma Vidya, Nirukti, astronomy, dance, music, etc. Education was not regarded as an end in itself. It was fundamentally related to life. Its aim was the attainment of Brahma Varchasya, that is the knowledge of the Absolute. The performance of sacrifice and other ritualistic operations were directed to the same end, but special emphasis was laid on the study of the scriptures, technically known as Swadhyay or self-study. It was a sort of sacrifice to Brahma, whereby the attainment of an imperishable world was possible. Hearing, thinking and meditation were the three principal psychological methods of instruction during the post-Vedic period. Teacher or the Guru enjoyed a predominant place not only in his Gurukul but also in the entire society. The teacher was expected to be in possession of the essential qualities, that is profundity of education, clairvoyant vision and intellectual regeneration. Rules of conduct were enforced, keeping in view the physical, mental, oral and moral development of students. Strict adherence to rules of conduct and discipline was an inseparable aspect of education in those days, and the duration of education was 12 years. Students had to beg alms for the support of the Guru and himself. This tradition was carried out by all, be he rich or poor, and this would beget in the students the virtue of humility, and thereby he learned the concrete lesson of charitable good done to him by the society, and in return his sense of obligation to it. Simple living and high thinking was the motto of his life. At the completion of their educational period, the teachers would deliver convocational address to the students, which sought to remind them of the duties in practical life they stood at the threshold of. This was the Samvartan ceremony. These final addresses of the teachers of ancient India can be compared to the convocation address of modern universities. The teacher was expected to possess all moral and spiritual qualifications. He illumined the inner being of his pupils with his own spiritual enlightenment. It was traditional knowledge to the pupils through a succession of teachers, which came to be known as Guru Parampara. The life of the teacher served as a model for the pupils to follow and imitate. Now we will look into the forms of some educational institutions which existed at that time. Broadly, there existed three types of institutions, namely Gurukuls, Parishads, academies, and Sammelans, that is the conferences in that age. According to sacred texts, the training of the Brahmin pupil took place at the home of a Brahmin teacher. In some texts, the Guru is depicted as the poor ascetic, and it is the duty of the student to beg for his teacher. The first lesson that was taught to the student was the performance of Sandhya and also reciting of Gayatri. The making of man was regarded as an artistic and not a mechanical process. Indeed, the aim of education was the developing of the pupil's personality, his innate and latent capacities. This view of education as a process of one's inner growth and self-fulfillment evolved its own technique, its rules, methods and practices. Besides these regular schools of instructions, there were special institutions for the promotion of advanced study and research. These are called in the Rig Veda as Brahm Sangh. These academics were called Parishads. There is a reference to the Panchal Parishad in the Upanishad, in whose proceedings even kings participated. Besides the local council or academics of disputants, there were invited occasionally by some great kings several scholars, rishis, philosophers and psychologists to a national gathering for the sake of discussions and debates. The ablest and the best scholars, speakers, philosophers and thinkers were awarded special prizes for their merits. In addition to the above mentioned forms of educational institution, the courts of the kings too served as important centers of learning, where several scholars and philosophers hailing from different countries would flock together, talk, discuss and throw light on metaphysical, theological and other problems. During the Vedic period, one could choose a particular profession as he liked, and accordingly his varn was determined. But during the later Vedic period, the varn came to be determined by birth. Consequently, the whole society was divided into four varnas: Brahma, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. Secular education was prescribed for all these varnas or castes according to the requirements of their respective duties they had to perform in life towards the society. As regards the Vaishyas, agriculture and animal husbandry and trade was the chief occupation, and as such they were given technical education of agriculture, animal husbandry and trade. Education of the Vaishyas too was under the direct control and supervision of the Brahmans. Study of Vedas was regarded as of secondary magnitude to them. Knowledge of various languages, rates of wages, rules applicable to purchase and sale of commodities was regarded as indispensable for the Vaishyas. To acquire this cumulative information, the study of arithmetic, general geography as well as economic and commercial geography, science of agriculture and business method was extremely essential. Now we come on to the education in the sutras and epics. Education in the sutras. The period of the Vedic literature was followed by that of the Sutra literature. It falls between 600 BC and 200 BC. The growth of Vedic literature had become so vast and diffuse that the need was strongly felt to evolve some practicable method as may epitomize conveniently the huge mass of Vedic literature. This need brought a new type of literature, the sutras, into being. These sutras revealed great principles and truths in a very compressed and succinct form. In this age, the rules and regulations of education were manifested mainly in the form of Dharma Sutras. These Dharma Sutras embodied the principles of social conduct and a code of duties for the teachers and students. The entire Sutra literature consists of mainly 6 divisions known as Vedangas. A pre-knowledge of various subjects such as Siksha, Chadas, Vyakaran, Kalp and Jyotish was indispensable for the sake of comprehending the Vedas. This period is the most important one from the viewpoint of its constructive and creative aspect in ancient Indian education, inasmuch as such important branches of learning as geography, algebra, astronomy, astrology, physiology and grammar reached culminating point in this period. The educational system during the Sutra period was identical with that of Upanishad period. All the current unwritten regulations, social and religious traditions and long-standing conventions had been compiled in the sutras in a well-arranged and systematic order. Various sciences and arts such as handicrafts, medicine, sculpture and architecture had attained the peak of development. Thus, the sole objective of the entire system of education during this period was character formation, development of personality and protection of the ancient culture. Education in the epics. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata are the main epics of ancient India. These epics give us glimpses into the creed of militarism of that age. Nevertheless, there are in them scattered facts which throw light upon the education of that period. The Mahabharata tells of numerous hermitages where pupils from distant parts gathered for instruction round some far-famed teachers. A full-fledged ashram is described as consisting of several departments which are as follows: the Agnisthan, the place for fire worship and prayers; the Brahmasthan, the department of Veda; Vishnusthan, the department for teaching Rajniti and Vrat; Mahendrasthan, military section; Vivasthan, department of astronomy; Somsthan, the department of botany; Garudsthan, section dealing with transport and conveyances; Kartikesthan, section teaching military organization, how to form patrols, battalions and army. The most important of such hermitage was that of the Naimisha, a forest which was like a university. The presiding personality of the place was Saunaka, to whom was applied the designation of Kulpati, sometimes defined as the preceptor of 10,000 disciples. The hermitage of Vyas was another seat of learning. There Vyas taught the Vedas to his disciples. Among the other hermitages noticed by the Mahabharata may be mentioned those of Vashisht and Vishwamitra, and that in the forest of Kamyaka on the banks of the Saraswati. But a hermitage near Kurukshetra deserves special notice for the interesting fact recorded that it produced 2 noted women hermits. Military science was generally called Dhanurved, and the Mahabharata marks the culmination of military art and science. In ancient times, military education was not only organized by the state, but on the other hand, private individual instructors too would undertake this duty. To sum up, in ancient India, secular vocational training was essentially a practical and useful education. There was complete absence of formal paraphernalia of education required in modern times. Education was imparted by the father to his son according to practical and direct method. Industrial occupations were at the peak. Indian artists have bequeathed to the world many fine artistic creations which will be regarded as the valuable treasure of the past, present as well as the future. Now we move on to the Brahmanic education. Most of the aspects of human existence found fullest scope for development and evolution during the period of the Vedic education. The Brahminical education has its own peculiar importance as regards the harmonious development of physical, mental and spiritual aspects of human life. It helped a lot in the development of character and individuality of human beings. Mr. F.E. Key, in his book named History of Indian Education, Ancient and Later Times, observes, not only did Brahmin education develop a system of education which survived the crumbling empires and the changes of the society, but they also, through all these thousands of years, kept a glow of the torch of higher learning and numbered amongst them many great thinkers who have left their mark not only on the learning of India but upon the intellectual life of the world. Thus, the aim of Brahminic education was similar to the aim of Vedic education, when the education was considered to be a means of gaining knowledge. Self-reliance, self-control, formation of character, individual development, knowledge of social and civil life and preservation of national culture was accompanied with the physical development as the aim of education. Some important characteristics of Brahminic education were as follows. The disciple lived in direct contact with the Acharya. The daily routine of the students was regulated. Brahminic education paid a good deal of attention to the formation of character and nature of the students. The students were supposed to maintain strict celibacy. It prepared the students for the entire life in its fullness. Yet the tendency towards specialization had grown up. In Brahminic education, instead of collective teaching, individual teaching prevailed. Thus, there were more opportunities to develop the inner talents of the students. Brahminic education was not only theoretical, it also gave the practical knowledge to face the struggles of life. In Brahminic education, the course of study was much more vast than that of the Vedic period. Besides all the four Vedas, the study of Itihas, Puranas, Vyakarans, arithmetic, astrology, ethics, Yajurved, etc. were also undertaken. The education was based on psychological principles. Corporal punishment was considered a sin. Students were free to study according to their choice and ability. In Brahminic education, Kand, Siddhant and stratification of caste system also had an effect on the courses of study. The oral system of teaching and learning followed in the Vedic period continued in the Brahminic age too. They were made to practice self-study. A new system of education whereby through examples and parabolas, great and abstract moral truths were made easy and understandable. The students had to study in the Gurukuls for about 12 years. After that, they were allowed to go home and the Guru gave them final instructions. This ritual was called the Samvartan Sanskar. They were at that time especially instructed to speak the truth, to fulfill the duties and never to be careless in self-study. The curriculum was basically predominated by religious elements, production of literature pertaining to Havan, Yagn, etc., Itihas and Purans, and variety of subjects of worldly and spiritual concerns. In short, in spite of many defects, this system of education was more or less ideal and well planned, and it did succeed in bringing about the all-round development of the personality of the educants. Now we move on to the education in the Buddhist era. Buddhist education can be rightly regarded as a phase of the ancient Hindu system of education. Buddhism itself, especially in its original and ancient form, is, as has been admitted on all hands, rooted deeply in the pre-existing Hindu system of thought and life. The monasteries were the centers of education during the Buddhist period. Besides the monasteries, there were no other organizations for imparting education. Only the bhikshus could receive religious and other types of education. Other persons were deprived of this facility. There were no place for yagd in the Buddhist system. For admission, the student had to present himself before the teacher and request him for giving education. The teacher was fully responsible for education of his pupil. In turn, the pupil had also to be responsive to the instructions received from the teacher. Thus, a relationship was established between the teacher and taught as during the Vedic period. Pabajja, the first ordination. It means going out. According to this ceremony, the student, after being admitted to a monastery, had to renounce all his worldly and family relationships. After admission into Sangh, they could remain as a monk. The age limit fixed for Pabajja was 8 years. At the time of entering into the Sangh, the disciple must have attained the age of 8 years. There they had to receive education for 12 years, and during this period the new monk made his preparation for the Sangh life. After that, he had to undergo the Upsampada ceremony, which entitled a student for a full-fledged membership of the monastery. The Upsampada, that is the final ordination. After completing education for about 12 years, the monk at the age of 20 years had to undergo the Upsampada ritual, and then he becomes the permanent member of the Sangh. This ceremony was democratic in nature. The Shraman had to present himself before all the monks, that is the bhikshus of the monastery. One could be admitted for the Upsampada ceremony only when the majority of the monks voted in favor of the same. There always existed cordial relationship between the teacher and taught. The teacher too had to observe all these rules of conduct which were prescribed for the students. It was the highest and the most sacred duty of the teacher to impart intellectual and spiritual education of a highest order to his disciples. If any pupil ignored to respect his preceptor, he was deemed unfit and consequently was expelled from the order. The teacher too put forth the ideal of higher learning, excellent moral character, self-possession and spiritualism before his pupils to compel inherent high respect from them. It was chiefly, the curriculum of the Buddhist education was chiefly spiritual in nature. It was so because the chief aim of education was to attain salvation. The study of religious books was most important. Sutanta, Vinaya and Dhamma were the main subjects prescribed for the study. Besides these, spinning, weaving, printing of cloths, sketching, medicine, surgery and coinage were the other subjects of Buddhist education. In the higher education, religion, philosophy, military science, medicine and other difficult subjects were taught. The Vedas were also studied for acquiring comparative knowledge. Nevertheless, the Atharvaved was not included in the curriculum up to the Jatak period. In the primary education, the emphasis was given on teaching of reading, writing and arithmetic. Knowledge of grammar was essential and the child was primarily educated in the knowledge of alphabets, vowels, sandhis or rules of combination. The main aim of education in Buddhist period was the purity of character. Therefore, like Vedic educational system, they also emphasized much on the practice and training for pure character instead of psychological development of the students. Later on, to attain the stage of Bodhisattva, personal development was considered essential and mental and moral development began to be emphasized. The teaching method in regard to technical education in secular science, arts and crafts was identical with that of the Brahmanical education, that is, the students were given education through both theoretical and practical methods. On the beginning, that is the Pratipada and close Purnima of each month, learned people used to assemble together. This type of assembling together was a very important part of Buddhist education. Purpose of this assembly was to maintain the moral standards of all the monks because the total education system was based on morality. Indeed, Buddhist education was basically religious, yet occupational education was not neglected altogether, and Mahabhagga mentions about spinning and weaving, tailoring, etc. Among the other useful arts, architecture, arithmetic, painting, agriculture and animal husbandry, etc. was also taught. In short, the following conclusions may be drawn in regard to the Buddhist education. In Buddhist period, there were many such centers where foreign students used to come for higher education, and among such centers, Takshila was the most notable. The minimum age for admission in Takshila University was 16 years because here the students were taken only for the higher studies. It was about 1000 coins. The fees was about 1000 coins at that time, which was probably charged in the beginning, and those who were unable to pay the fees in any form, either cash or manual labor, were educated as a charity. The meritorious students who did not have means to support themselves were given scholarship by the government of that time. Generally, the students lived in the centers with the teacher, but some married people and students residing in private lodges were also not prohibited from gaining education. In higher education, students were taught literary, scientific and vocational education. In literary education, religious teachings was also included. Some students who could not get mentally satisfied even through higher studies used to go to the isolated place of some monk and spend their lives in search of truth and nirvana. Gradually gaining spiritual knowledge, they became ascetics in their future life. Now we will make a comparative study of Brahmanic and Buddhist system of education. Buddhist education was to a great extent influenced by Brahmanic education, so their basic principles were similar in many respects. The daily life of bhikshus was more or less improved form of brahmacharis. Their mode of living, food arrangements and clothing etc. were almost similar. Most of the Brahmanic rishis and Buddhists were spending their lives in similar manner in isolated cottages, in the forests or on the hills, practicing self-realization, devoting the rest of their lives in higher studies. In spite of the similarities, there were many remarkable differences in both the system of education. Firstly, Buddhist education was meant for religious expansion, whereas Brahmanic education was for life. Brahmanic education was aimed at the usefulness of life. After Samvartan ritual, the rishis had to enter the family life, and if possible, they could again live in the last quarter of their lives as sannyasis. But Buddhist education aimed at the study and nirvana and spread of Buddhism, and so the Buddhist monks were not allowed to enter the marital and worldly life. Secondly, Buddhist education was democratic, while the Brahmanic education was monocratic. In Brahmanic system, the disciple always remained disciple for his teacher, though he might gain even higher knowledge. But in Buddhist system, as it was based on democratic principles, the bhikshu after becoming Shraman was kept in the category of the Upadhyaya and was respected equally. Thus bhikshu on one side respected his Upadhyaya and on the other he himself was respected. Thirdly, Buddhist education was collective and Brahmanic education was individual. In Brahmanic system, Gurukul system was prevalent. Here, the teacher taught the students under his direct guardianship. But in Buddhist system, education was given in monasteries and vihars and greater importance was attached to collective education. Fourthly, Brahmanic system imposed more restriction on the students than the Buddhist system. In Brahmanic system, luxuries were strictly prohibited. But in Buddhist system, the rules were not so rigid. Fifthly, Buddhist education was free from restrictions, whereas Brahmanic education maintained it. In Buddhist Sangh, anyone might enter it without consideration of caste, creed, etc. and gain education to improve his capability. In Brahmanic system, it was not so. Great importance was attached to the one of the student. Sixthly, under the Brahmanical system of education, the pupil had to observe strict physical and mental discipline. He was to treat pleasure and its agencies as taboo. Student life was fraught with austerities. But according to the Buddhist system, the body is to be decently draped, cleansed and massaged, regularly fed, sheltered in the rainy season, rested during the noon and medically treated when ailing by the best physician of the country. The critical assessment of the Buddhist and the Brahmanic education. Buddhist education was not altogether immune from defects. Not unlike Vedic education, it was also dominated by religion. So much so that arts and crafts in the last phase of it came to be looked down upon by the members of higher classes and ultimately they gave them up completely. Military art and science, art of manufacturing arms and weapons and the art of warfare could not develop much under the Buddhist system of education as it was based on the principles of non-violence and renunciation of the world. According to Buddhist religion, the world is full of sorrow. Therefore, the sole aim of life was considered to be the attainment of salvation, nirvana, by renouncing the world. The meaning of struggle of life was confined to mere metaphysical speculation. Still, it is acknowledged that merits of Buddhist system of education far outweigh the defects and flaws, though it was through its shortcomings that its downfall was so sudden and sure, and in its stead, the Brahmanical system of education was re-established in the country. In short, it can be said that Buddhist education laid the foundation stone of a high culture. Though Indian attitude towards life had always tended to be characterized by piety and sanctity, Yet the Buddhist education intensified and elevated it still more. The foreign students made a very profound study of Indian religion, literature and system of education and disseminated the seeds of Indian culture in their own lands. The sacred portals of the Buddhist institutions were open to all, where all the students without differences were provided with equal opportunities for the development of their character according to their capacity and aptitudes. Along with religious and philosophical aspects of the Buddhist education, secular education formed an essential part of it. This system gave birth to such international institutions as Nalanda, Taxila and Vikramshila, which were the centers of both religious and secular learning. Education was closely wedded to the various problems of life, and it aimed at finding out concrete solutions thereof. Thus, in the sphere of morals and discipline, the Buddhist system of education enriched human life considerably. It is largely through the long-standing traditional background of Buddhist education that we are still able to continue our harmonious cultural, political and economic relations with the far eastern countries of Asia. Now we come at the end of the lecture, which is the most important part of the ancient India, and here we will describe some main educational centers and universities which have existed and made their name in ancient India. The study of the education system in Vedic period and Brahmanical educational system makes it clear that in those days the residence of the teachers, gurus, were the educational institutions called gurukuls. There the teacher and the taught lived together as the members of the single family. For the spiritual and philosophical development of the taught, the external objects of education were not much emphasized, but the main emphasis was laid on inner and spiritual uplift. In ancient India, in Vedic and Buddhist periods, well-organized educational institutions like that of modern age had not come into being. In those days, some monasteries and youth sacred places had been established. It is said that the learned persons from different places used to assemble there and debates and discussions took place. Inspired by the Buddhist system in Hindu temples and monasteries too, the educational institutions were started. Lord Buddha was the person who had realized the necessity of education for devotees at large, and so he established the monasteries and vihars, where education was also imparted. Later on, these monasteries were turned into full-fledged centers of education, where bhikshus, bhikshunis and even common people were given chance to acquire education. Besides, the foreigners also came here to study Buddhist religion. Consequently, Nalanda and Takshila developed into universities of international importance. Generally, the educational institutions of the Buddhist period were managed on the basis of democratic principles. The appointments were made purely on the basis of learning qualification. Educational expansion was fully carried out by these educational centers. Cultural relations with many Asian countries are mainly due to these educational institutions and their working system that existed hundreds of years back. Now we shall describe some important centers of learning of the Buddhist period, and of these institutions, Taxila, Nalanda, Vallabhi, Vikramshila, Odantapuri, Nadia, Mithila and Jagadala require special mention. We shall start with the description of Taxila. From times immemorial, Taxila has been an important center of Brahmanical education. During the Buddhist period, its fame continued in northern India. It attracted hundreds of students from various countries of the world. They came there to quench the thirst of their knowledge. Being situated at the distance of 20 miles in the west of Rawalpindi, Taxila was the capital of Gandhar kingdom. According to Valmiki Ramayana, Prince Bharat founded the city and appointed his son Taksha as the ruler of the territory. There was no organized institution or university, but education was imparted on family system. Takshashila was also not an organized university. It may be called an educational center of different subjects where special and higher studies were carried on. Students were admitted according to the decision of the teacher. The students were taught the subjects of their own choice. There was no examination system prevalent. No degree or diploma was awarded to the students who completed their education. Only higher studies were conducted in Takshashila, and so the students of more than 16 years of age were admitted in the university. Perhaps the fees was also realized in the beginning. Here the chief branches and subjects of study were Vedatre, 3 Vedas, Vedanta, Vyakaran, Ayurveda, 18 Sippas, military education, astronomy, agriculture, commerce, snake bite cure, etc. Panini, the father of Vyakaran in Jivaka, an expert in surgery and medicine, were the product of Taxila. Kautilya, the famous author of Arthashastra, had received his higher education here. No caste distinction was observed as regards the training in these sciences. Taxila had been influenced by Greek culture also. Some preceptors taught Greek there. Taxila was very famous as a center of training in Indian military science. Thus, for several centuries, Taxila served as the beacon light to country in educational sphere. This light of earning continued to burn in spite of vicissitudes of fortune and stormy changes. At length, it was overwhelmed by the barbaric Huns who extinguished this flame forever, never to shine anew. Next in line is Nalanda. In the province of Bihar, situated at a distance of 40 miles southwest of modern Patna and 7 miles north of Rajgiri, Nalanda was a famous cultural and educational center of northern India. In the beginning, it was a small village, but by and by its importance grew in magnitude. This place began to grow in importance since the rise of Mahayana branch of Buddhism in the 1st century AD. By the beginning of 4th century AD, it became educationally important and famous. Nalanda received its zenith of progress at the hands of the kings of Gupta dynasty. Kumaragupta first built a monastery there. A big and strong enclosing wall having only one gateway marked off the entire university area. At this gate there lived a teacher designated as Dwar Pandit, who was in charge of the test for admission to the university. The gate opened into 8 big halls where students were delivered addresses en masse. These halls stood in the middle of Samgharm that comprised the main building of the Vihar. Besides these, there were 300 study chambers where students were taught by the preceptors. In Nalanda, higher studies were carried on. Meritorious students from far and wide came to this university to quench the thirst of knowledge. It was considered to be a great center of learning throughout the whole of Asia. The admittance examination in Nalanda was not easy, and according to Yun Sang, only about 20% of the students succeeded in this examination. The minimum age limit was 20 years for admission into the university. Education, board and lodging were provided to the students free of cost by the university. The Kulpati or Chancellor of the university was Shilbhadra. He had studied all sutras and shastras books and may explain them fully well. The scope of study in Nalanda was very vast. Besides the study of Buddhism and Buddhist literature, all other subjects of the time were also included in the course of study. Though the Vihar belonged to Mahayana school of Buddhism, yet Hinayana scriptures was also taught there. Vedas, Vedanta, Sankhya, philosophy, Dharmashastra, Puran, Jyotish, Ayurveda, etc. were the subject of study along with physical education. It is evident that Nalanda was an eminent center of learning and illuminated our country for centuries to come with his undimmed light of knowledge. It has made unique contributions to the evolution, expansion and refinement of the Indian culture. Third is Vallabhi. Another important education center of Buddhist period was Vallabhi, the capital seat of Maitrak kings between 475 and 775 AD. Like Yun Sang, I Sing too found Vallabhi in the western side of India as glorious as Nalanda, and students from every part of India would flock there for education. The center was famous not only as a center of Buddhist culture and learning, but also for the religious tolerance and mental freedom. Next, Vikramshila. The Vihar of Vikramshila was established by the famous Emperor Dharmpal of Pal dynasty in the 8th century in northern Magad at a beautiful hill on the bank of river Ganges. The university was later organized into 6 colleges. In the center, there was the central big building having 6 gates connected with each other. The college was situated in front of it, and this central building was called the Vigyan Bhavan. Vikramshila University was destroyed by Bhakhtiyar Khilji in 1203 AD. It is said that the Muslims took the Vihar as a fort and they killed most of the monks. Next, Udantapuri. This university had been established long before the kings of Pal dynasty came into power in Magadh. Udantapuri could not attain that level of fame and repute which either Nalanda or Vikramshila had accomplished. Next, Jagadala. Pal king Raja Rampal of Bengal had set a city on the banks of Ganga. It was the beginning of the 11th century and it was named as Ranavati. He also constructed a monastery and named it as Jagadala. Mithila. In the Upanishadic age, Mithila became a prominent seat of Brahminical system of education. It was named as Videha. Famous poet Vidyapati, who had written in Hindi, and Jaydev, who was a prominent poet of Sanskrit literature, were born here. Next, Nadia. Nadia was formerly called Navdeep. It is situated at the confluence of Ganga and Jalangi rivers in Bengal. It was the center of trade and commerce as well as learning and culture. The lyrics of Geet Govind by Jaydev still reverberate in the ears of the people. The importance of Nadia grew still more as a result of the downfall of Nalanda and Vikramshila, and it began to be regarded as an eminent center of Hindu culture and education. So dear friends, here we come to the end of the overview of the ancient Indian education, whereby we had gone through the Brahminical education, the Buddhist education, the education during the epics and the Sutra period, the Rig Vedic education, and we also saw how the education evolved during all the 4 Vedas. I hope you enjoyed the lecture today and you must have received some input as far as the ancient Indian education system is concerned. Thank you very much.